Okay.
Because it's like how to just talking about things that are like outside the norms.
2 minutes, then we'll start.
It's outside the norms. So it's kind of like yeah. But then you're like, oh gosh.
And that's what you got the social psychology part.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Still have a few minutes to go. Everybody have a good weekend? Good. Happy Halloween. Thank you.
Forgot that was
I still have 2 that dress up. Yeah, walking around the neighborhood tonight.
my mom. Oh, tell her I say hi. I haven't picked up my mail, so she's been cute. What? I haven't picked up my mail in a while. She's like, have you picked it up yet?
Hey, Brian. We'll start right on time. So.
Okay, so this is like my, like normally like my week. I'm not like block out and do it. But next week, I have one in-person class next week. Well, because he's gone. Oh, and he has all of my classes.
Oh, gotcha, okay.
And then Tuesday's election day, so my other site classes canceled. I have one in-person class. That is, because all of those online, like my assignments and projects, for like my health and wellness and stuff and all that is coming up, so that's amazing.
What's Sam?
And so I texted, I have triathlon t-shirts and this morning.
Oh, yeah, no way.
Yeah, it's like no idea about it or not, but I'm like, let me tell you.
Oh my god. I know, he just came out in his space. I was like, yeah.
It's no. I know, I'm just not gonna let him because I was like, what's he like? And he was like, you need your wellness. Yeah, but he said the word.
That's not right.
I have a walk out, so I'm in front of every single
Oh my gosh.
I always have like the dreams where I'm like things.
Alright, welcome.
So I hope everyone's doing great. So let's talk about procedures for the next couple of weeks. I'm out of town next week, so you'll have some assignments posted on D2L for this class. So I've got the folder ready, but I haven't got the assignment there yet. So if you go to D2L, folder's right here. So you'll be able to click on that, and there'll be a couple of short assignments there for you.
So no class Monday or Wednesday.
So I've got a town. Okay, so when I get back, we'll finish out the rest of chapter 9, probably get maybe halfway through today. We may even start into chapter 10 on that Monday, but the next exam will be Wednesday, November 16th. over chapters 6, 7, and 8. So we'll get finished with chapter 8 today. I'll have the study guide posted before I leave, so you'll be able to see the study guide for exam 3 just in that folder. It'll be there. So for lab, the same thing. So you have just some article questions that aren't due for 2 weeks for lab. Just a reminder, everyone was great today coming in shorts for lab, so you'll need shorts for Wednesday lab. Makes electrode application a lot easier. So we'll progress with our EMG into maximal voluntary contractions. Talk a little bit about how to calculate normalized values, and then when you come back for lab, we'll do an actual spreadsheet. We'll do an analysis for I'll pick 1 or maybe 2 people, and we'll analyze their results for the leg extension and squat. So get to learn how to do that. So questions? Okay, so before then, warm-up exercise, right? So I said this wasn't going away, so here we are. Number 8. All the movement analyses we've done are in that folder and under the content browser. You can always go back if you are missing one.
I know. The upper buildings just hold all the time.
All right. So some of these muscle groups should be coming together, your flexors and extensors and abductors and adductors. Trying to pick out some that are a little more unique, so it's not always your 4 hip extensors.
Yeah. 6:45 to 55. It's not too long. So I'm looking, and then I have to do tomorrow.
I do
So
have
really
the
exciting things. What about you?
muscles on D2L in the folder if you need it.
For the shoulder? Yeah. I think it'll just be, because if you're holding it out, it's flexing. Because like this would be.
Yeah, it's all fun. Yeah.
You're in some good discussion out there.
I'm like, so I just thought it was like different, and then that makes a lot more sense though. Function. Concentric, right?
I think so.
But it's going to back to ABD, so.
Yes.
What's the front page to good use? What's your coordinated action? Shoulder joint, shoulder girdle.
Elevation slash rotation.
So if you identified the first one as flexion of the shoulder joint, correct.
Yes, it's not the plane frontal
Okay.
axes, yes.
Oh, yeah, one patient. We were like, there's nothing in this one. We didn't get that with age. That's what we. The rotation. For the vertical axis, we technically we only have a vertical axis. No. I don't want to.
Okay, you're kind of on the,
No,
right.
elevation.
It would be if it was like, because elevation, it just means it's going up. But then would that be, because the arm, the shoulder is sagittal, but if they're going, maybe, is that just frontal? It's just up. No, it's not curving, it's just kind of sagittal.
So we do the sagittal plane frontal axis.
So I'm seeing a lot of you trying without your movement muscle sheet, which is good. That's what you want.
Because the shoulder, that's happening, this is happening in the sagittal.
Yep.
Can that be, can you have like two different, where this is sagittal, but then
Yeah,
your
it
scapula and
is.
stuff
We'll
is
just grant
frontal?
one before.
Okay. Yeah, I have.
You what? Oh, sorry.
It's not rotating around, it's just going up and down, which is
There's one in the back, so.
frontal plane.
And then the shoulder is still sagittal.
Always lowering versus lifting is the
That's
first
that one.
question.
I was trying to imagine it. Like, it makes sense in my head. I hope somehow can I get the transverse plane to just.
Too far, too
Yeah.
back it up.
Yep. You wrote horizontal abduction for the second one. That is correct.
Horizontal.
It's going towards the plane. Yes. Horizontal I think so.
You,
So. Is it the other way?
right hip, left knee. A little bit different than maybe some of the ones we've done in the past. So the last two are going to be eccentric. So we need to think
Is it the left knee or the right knee? What leg is on the box?
the right.
That was the left.
When he steps back, you can see the adductors on the left.
What's the one that's on the thing?
Jeff, can you repeat that? Which knee is on the box?
Right.
The right knee's on the box?
Right.
What?
That is tough, isn't it?
I
think it's- I take that back. Let's say the left foot is on the box.
What?
The left foot is on the box. Muscles will still match. So let's keep the left foot on the box.
Yes.
Eccentric, because we're rolling.
I think so, yeah.
stepping back with the right.
Yes.
Stepping back with the right.
Wait,
Because the left one's gonna be flat. The one on the bottom. What?
so this is the left.
The right hip.
joint is the one.
Wait, so the right hip joint is the one that's back.
Yes.
Thank you.
Center that's using flexion muscle.
Right, right.
Yeah, that's
There's no
what,
way it's using muscle.
that's where we were confused
Yeah.
too. It doesn't add up. I don't know.
The math thing.
Well, it doesn't like make sense either like that. There's no way you're using those muscles. So is it like
That was a little bit confusing, isn't it?
We were just,
so it is using that?
we were right.
So just.
Flexion.
Which, see, math wise, I know it's flexion. I don't know why though. That's flexion. Because wouldn't that be extension?
No, because extension is.
That'll match. So what if
Is this chapter 9 or 10?
It is a little
Oh,
bit
wait, that's
different.
not. I meant.
So it's extending. If flexion's this way, extension's back.
Yeah.
Let me show you. What chapter are we on?
So
9?
what are you still like sensors? Or
Because I need to
Ankle, okay.
lowering, so kind of like,
I'm coming.
I think that tried to make sense, but.
It is.
unless we have a joint
Conference
action now.
board. Here, I can show here.
Because he said the last two words. So the extension.
Yeah, you're
Come back
right.
to number 3 in a minute. Why don't everybody go on to this one? It's a little more clear on this one.
I think it's because the knee is bent. That's why it's not extension. Because of this right here.
So, yeah, everyone work on the last one and then.
Because it's your hip is extended, like if you think about it, your hip is going to turn out. If you like take away the rest of the leg. Yeah, I think so. That's what
Because when you're,
I'll do my first instinct was.
when you're going down, you're further up, isn't it? So that's the only reason.
Yeah, because
Remember the table?
yeah, I think it's just not Yeah.
Here we go.
All right.
Duck.
About one more minute. Don't worry if you don't have the third one, just go right on to this last one.
The knee is extended. The hip is in flexion. I know that doesn't help because you still want to know why. Are we on the last one?
Okay, so let's get back together for a moment. So, seemed like almost everybody did okay with the first one, right? So shoulder flexion, and then from the first page, your movement and muscles. What'd you get for the scapula?
Elevation of rotation.
Elevation, upward rotation. So lifting or lowering?
Lifting.
Lifting, so concentric, and then the corresponding muscles there. So your flexors, and then your elevators and upward rotators for the shoulder girdle, for the scapula. And so What'd you have for your scapular muscles? Elevators and upward rotators. Looked like 6 of them. What were they?
Traps, upper and lower, and
So the whole traps, everything with the traps, serratus anterior, what else?
Rhomboids.
Rhomboids, levator scapula. Any others? Is that all 6? Got them all? Okay, great. Okay, so the plane for the scapula. Now elevation, upward rotation is going to be in the frontal plane. So we're looking at from a straight on view, out to the side, plus up like this. So that's frontal plane, sagittal axis. For the shoulder flexors, what 3 muscles did you get there? Deltoid, coracobrachialis. Yeah, pec major, what part? Yeah, so the clavicular or upper portion of the pec major. Plane is going to be sagittal, axis is going to be frontal on that one. So, okay. So again, trying as we've looked at just about everything over these 8 movement analyses, it seems like, trying to get variations. So it seemed like a lot of you were able to identify this as horizontal abduction at the shoulder joint. So a little bit unusual way, but very effective. So shoulder horizontal abduction, lifting or lowering. Yeah, lifting from top to bottom, lifting. Okay, so it'd be concentric, and then you have your 5 shoulder horizontal abductors. Okay, so those are on your sheet, so we don't need to list them. And then it's actually going to be transverse plane vertical or longitudinal axis on that one. So on the axis, and for the plane for that matter, if sometimes there's a different word like horizontal plane. If you like that better than transverse, that's fine. If you like vertical versus longitudinal axis, that's fine as well. Okay, so now this one. Okay, so left foot on the box, so it's a little easier to identify what's going on there. So I guess lowering or lifting? What's our question?
Lowering.
Yeah, so lowering, so it's going to be eccentric. Okay, so it's an eccentric action of the quadriceps, right? Okay, so your 4 quadriceps, 3 vasti, 1 rectus femoris, sagittal plane, frontal axis. Now, on the right hip joint, what I was going for there is an eccentric action of the hip extensors. So, admittedly, it maybe wasn't clear with your movement and muscle sheet, so that was my mistake on that one, but what I was going for was an eccentric action of the hip extensors. So the hip is extending. So this is one of the exceptions to the rule. There's always exceptions to the rule, no matter what aspect of science. There's always an exception. So what I was going for here is hip extension, eccentric, but here we're still engaging the hip extensors. So promise I won't put one like this on the exam where it would be confusing. So it'd be clear. So the 4 hip extensors, and we all know what those are, glutes and your 3 hamstrings. So sagittal plane and frontal axis on this one. Okay, so that's what I was going for here was hip extension and eccentric. So it's an exception to the rule with your movement and muscle handout is what I'm trying to say. So I apologize for any confusion there.
How are you exception to the rule?
Because normally you take the opposing joint action with the muscles for an eccentric action.
So why wouldn't it be in this case?
Because it's not hip flexion, it's still hip extension with eccentric. So, okay, so for the last one, how many know what kind of squat this is? This is sometimes called a Cossack squat. I have no idea how these things get their names. C-O-S-A-C-K, Cossack squat. So let's talk about the left knee to start off with. So from the picture in the back to the picture in the front, what happens with the left knee? knee joint is flexing. What type of muscle action is it though? It's eccentric, so here we're being consistent with how your movement and muscle sheet works. So what muscles do you actually have to look at for the left knee? So it's controlling the flexion of the knee joint. Controlling the flexion of the knee joint. So it'd be the quadriceps group, rectus femoris, and your 3 vasti muscles. So looking at the left knee from the back picture to the front picture, you're just controlling the flexion of that. So it'd be the 4 quadricep muscles. Okay. For the right hip now, what I was going on that one, first of all, is it eccentric or concentric? Still eccentric. What I was going for was using the hip adductors, but eccentrically. So the joint action is actually going to be ab with a B, abduction, but what muscles are controlling the abduction? The hip adductors, ADD, adductors are controlling the joint action of abduction. So what did you get for your 5 hip adductors? Yeah, adductor longus, magnus, brevis. What other ones do we have in there? Gracilis, actineus. So lots of adductors of the hip. So for the right hip, it's going out to the side. So what plane is to the side? Yeah, frontal plane, sagittal axis. For the left knee, though, we're just flexing, keeping it in line with the body front to back. So it's going to be sagittal plane on that one, frontal axis for the knee joint. All right, so questions? All right, so we have to progress a little bit, so my bad on that third one. I should have put a little more thought into that, but I think everybody's doing okay. All right, so my next goal, I want to finish off chapter 8 and go a little bit into chapter 9. So we've been looking at the hip joint. What's the functional classification of the hip joint? Well, the diarthrodial classification would be what? Anarthrodial, sometimes called ball and socket, right? Okay, so we're talking about the head of the femur that rotates within the acetabulum on the pelvis. So we can have closed chain joint actions, where it's the pelvis rotating about a fixed femoral head, or we can have open chain joint actions that tend to be a lot easier to identify, where the pelvis is fixed and we have rotation of the femoral head within the acetabulum. So either way, it's still going to be hip joint motion. So we went over those examples of open versus closed chain. So we have 7 muscles that have actions at both the hip and the knee joint. Do you remember what those are? So we have 3 hamstrings, right? What are they? Not biceps brachii, but biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. So that's 3 out of 7. Which one of the quadriceps group that we're looking at in lab this week crosses both the hip and the knee? Huh? Right down the middle. Yeah, rectus femoris. Okay, so it has its site of origin there at the anterior inferior iliac spine, and then inserts with the other quadriceps. So rectus femoris. Okay, so then there's a muscle on the outside. TFL is the acronym. Tensor fascia lata. Okay, so there's a muscle on the inside, starts with a G. Yeah, gracilis. Okay. What's the longest muscle in the body? Sartorius is right. So that's all 7 that have actions in both the hip and the knee joints, which kind of, if you're looking at lots of actions in daily life, we have rotation about both the hip and the knee. So we can have issues of passive insufficiency, where a muscle becomes excessively stretched, so a joint won't rotate any further. We can have issues of active insufficiency, where a muscle becomes excessively contracted, so it won't contract any further and cause joint rotation. So these issues come into play with electromyography. When you have a movement like the squat that involves a muscle like the rectus femoris that crosses both the hip and the knee joint versus the vastus medialis that affects just the knee joint. So at any rate, so let's move on and examine some of these other muscles. So the iliopsoas is actually a group of 3 muscles. So you have the psoas minor, the psoas major. So whenever you have a minor and a major, usually the minor is superior, the major is inferior. So in this case, we have the psoas minor and the psoas major. So same thing if we look at the teres minor and teres major. Teres major is inferior, teres minor is superior in their position. The iliacus is right here, so it has it's kind of has a radiate arrangement, so a broad attachment point across the interior crest of ilium, and then everything comes down, so both parts of the psoas muscle come down, everything has its insertion on the lesser trochanter. So one of the things to keep in mind is any time you have a muscle that originates on the anterior side of the pelvis but inserts on the posterior side of the femur, it's going to be an external rotator of the hip. So remember, muscles usually contract from the point of insertion towards the point of origin. So the origin is more stable. Okay, so that's all this up here. This is the stable part. Down here is the insertion point where all of these fibers converge onto that lesser trochanter. So the muscle, not always, but typically, it's the origin that's fixed, and the fibers are pulling from the insertion towards the origin. So what the effect of that is to turn the hip out. As it's pulling in this direction, the hip is going to rotate this way. Okay, so this group is oftentimes known as the single joint hip flexors. Single joint hip flexors. Very important to maintain flexibility in this group. This group can also have the effect, if the femur is fixed, this group can also have the effect of tilting the pelvis forward. So if the lumbar spine and the pelvis are one segment, the femur is fixed, like in a standing position, the femur is fixed, closed chain position. This muscle contracting on both sides together is going to have the tendency to tilt the pelvis forward, like tilting a bucket forward. It'll take the lumbar spine with it because look at where it attaches to the bodies of the 12th thoracic and then all 5 lumbar vertebrae. So right along here, as well as these transverse processes. So if that muscle is really tight on both sides, it's going to have a tendency not only to tilt the pelvis forward, but if the pelvis tilts forward, what's going to happen to that normal lordotic curve in the lumbar spine? It's going to become even more curved, right? So what do we call excessive extension? What's our word for that? Hyperextension of the lumbar spine. That's not good because that places a lot of tensile stress on the front of the discs and a lot of compressive stress on the posterior part of the discs. Okay, so over time that can cause a lot of wear on the outer annulus of the disc. Eventually, what's in the middle of the discs that we have? You know, remember from Carl's class? You have that pulposus, okay, in the middle, kind of like that gelatinous substance that provides that shock absorption effect. So eventually that pulposus can migrate through the annulus and eventually poke out. So we call that a herniated disc. And that's bad because that can place pressure on those nerve roots at the side, part of that lumbar plexus. So very important things we can do in our lifestyle to prevent this type of stress on those passive tissues. We need to be flexible. We need to keep the single joint hip flexors nice and elongated. So we're not pulling the pelvis past neutral into an anterior tilt, taking the spine with it. Okay, so rectus femoris, very similar. This would be classified as a two-joint hip flexor. So remember what the title of the test was for testing two-joint versus single joint? So a couple slides ago, that was the Thomas test. Thomas test. So if you take biomechanics next semester, you get to do the Thomas test. So we'll save that for biomechanics. But rectus femoris, site of origin, anterior inferior. So note the inferior because the sartorius has its origin up here at the anterior superior. Rectus femoris, along with the other quadriceps, attaches to the base of the patella here and then to the tibial tuberosity via the patellar tendon. So a unique feature, rectus femoris, the only one of the quadriceps that has actions at both the hip and the knee joint. So to stretch this muscle, we have to flex the knee joint. So the best way to stretch it is to extend the hip and flex the knee because we want the opposing actions, right? So if it flexes the hip and extends the knee, then to stretch it, we want to do the opposite. So we extend the hip and we flex the knee joint. So remember the name of the stretch? The couch stretch. Anybody look that up or see it? Very good stretch. You don't need a couch for it. I'm not sure why it's called that, but that's what I've just heard. So, but it's a very good stretch to do on a daily basis. So we have these things that we should be doing on a daily basis just to keep our bodies tuned up and functional. Because we sitting around a lot, modern lifestyle, we get muscle imbalances just from lifestyle. So we need to get out of that and make sure we're balanced. Okay, so this is the Thomas test. Okay, so looking at this again, hip flexor assessment. And so we're laying back on a table to review, and we bring the contralateral leg into the chest with our hands, and then the free leg is the one that we're looking at. So the knee remains bent and relaxed, and if we notice that the knee is coming up like that, but the knee is staying bent, that's tightness of the psoas, single joint hip flexors. If we notice the knee stays down, but it extends like this, that's tightness of the rectus femoris. If we get both, elevation and extension, then it's both. So I like to just take care of it and just do the couch stretch is a good one. Just we get both at the same time with the stretch. Okay, sartorius. So anterior superior iliac spine crosses and becomes part of the pes anserinus insertion. Do you remember the other two muscles part of that? That's an excellent test question. So I think I'm hearing whispers that are correct. My ears are perking up. So semitendinosus and gracilis are the other two. So please commit those to memory because I guarantee you I'll ask that on the exam 3. So this has a lot of actions. It's a flexor of the hip and flexor of the knee joint. So if your hip is maximally flexed and your knee, and you try to maximally flex the knee joint, you have a hard time doing both actions to the fullest extent at the same time. That's what active insufficiency means. It also has the effect of externally rotating the thigh as the hip flexes and knee flexes. So basically, it's the leg crosser muscle. So if you lean back and cross your ankle over your knee, and I'm not asking you to do that, but when you do that, what are we doing at the hip? We're externally rotating at the hip. So 3 actions, all of those when you cross one ankle over a knee. in a closed chain position. So feet are planted, femoral heads are fixed. So now the lumbopelvic segment becomes the movable part. You're going to get anterior pelvic rotation. So the action kind of depends on whether it's open chain or closed chain. Closed chain is with the feet planted. Okay, pectineus, just an adductor. Listed that on our analysis today with the Cossack squat. It's an adductor, so it has its origin here on the anterior ramus of pubis, and then down here just below the lesser trochanter. So kind of getting to the very top of what we call the linea aspera. So that ridge of bone tissue on the back of the femur. The adductor brevis. Okay, so lots of adductors. All you have to remember is brevis longus magnus, and you've got 3 of them. So I want you to notice something in common among all the adductors. They have their insertion on this linea aspera, so on the posterior side. So remember what I said, if it has its origin more anterior and insertion posterior, it's going to be an external rotator. So one of the things I like to do when I study muscles is I kind of look for things in common. That helps me remember things in groups that, muscles that have a common action. So this has another radia type arrangement where a broad insertion that tapers down to a very narrow origin there. Okay, adductor longus. So something to remember about this one, in the case of a groin pull, this is the most common one. So that's implicated in that is the adductor longus. So I think it's because it's kind of right in the middle versus proximally or distally. So again, right on the linea aspera, just below the crest of pubis is its site of origin next to the symphysis pubis there. Okay, adductor magnus. Okay. One of the unique things about this muscle is that it also serves as a hip extensor. So I don't include that on your movement and muscle sheet as a hip extensor, but it actually has a pretty strong function because it has its insertion all along the length of the linea aspera, all the way down here to this little, kind of this raised ridge on the medial femur called the adductor tubercle. The adductor tubercle here. So it's along that posterior side and works with the hamstrings and gluteus maximus to be a hip extensor. So one of the biggest wastes of time you'll see in the gym is people spending time on the inner and outer thigh machines. You've seen that. Inner and outer thigh machines. So you're sitting there in a non-functional position, pushing your legs out, and then you reverse it, and then you pull your legs in. You need to be in a more functional position, and if you're worried about tightening up muscles in that area, just do squats and lunges and step-ups, because guess what? You're working one of the primary adductor muscles in extending the hip. So this muscle in here, this inner thigh muscle, gets plenty of work just with your regular functional type movements and so on. So lunges especially would be very effective for this muscle. Okay, gracilis, one of the other hip adductors. So there's several, okay. So several, 6 I think is what we listed, was it? 5 or 6? So the gracilis right here, the inferior ramus of pubis, coming down part of the pes anserinus insertion, right? Remember? So the pes anserinus insertion along with the sartorius semitendinosus is just right here, kind of just below the medial condyle of the tibia. Right in there. So those 3 muscles have that common insertion. So here we go, semitendinosus. So this shows a posterior view of the right femur. All of the hamstring muscles have a common origin. So that would be this ischial tuberosity. So that's the roughened part, sometimes known as the sit bone. So you're sitting right on the origin of those hamstring muscles. So is it any wonder those muscles tend to be a little overactivated and tight? So you have a foam roller at your apartment, right? And you're rolling every night, kind of loosening up that area. So foam rollers are great to have at home for just keeping everything in balance and functional. So semitendinosis, first of our semi-muscles, has a great big long tendon that we can palpate there on the medial side of the knee joint. Okay, semimembranosus is underneath. So we don't see very many, I can't think of an EMG study that I've seen. There's probably some that exist where people try to separate activity of the semimembranosus and semitendinosus. Semitendinosus is right over the top, so it's really difficult, at least with surface EMG, because you really can't see. You're just putting electrodes on the skin. It's hard to separate the activity of those two because they're in close proximity. So oftentimes EMG studies will just group those two together. But it has the same functions as the semitendinosus. So notice, same point of origin. Okay, so if the feet are planted in a closed chain position, like we do with RDLs, right? Good mornings and that. It's the lumbopelvic segment that is rotating about the femoral head. So the femoral heads are fixed, and now it's the lumbopelvic segment that is turning. So that's how we get activation of the hamstrings in that case. Okay, so biceps femoris. So two parts, right? One important thing to remember is both parts don't have action at the hip. So see the more lateral of the two heads would be the short head, and so it has attachment along the linea aspera, but it doesn't attach up here at the ischial tuberosity. So you look at these tendons down here, those are easily palpable on that side. So the semi-muscles come down and have their insertion down here. The bicep femoris has its insertion over here, lateral femoral condyle as well as the head of the fibula. So you can come down right on your fibular head, just above that. If you can palpate, you can kind of feel that tendon right here that has its attachment near the top of the fibular head. Okay, gluteus maximus, largest muscle in the body. So it has the highest mass of any muscle in the body. This muscle tends to be underactivated in a lot of people. So if it's underactivated, a lot of the stress tends to go into the lumbar muscles. Is it any wonder why so many people have low back pain? Okay. So the idea is to improve activation of the gluteus maximus, which takes the stress off the back. So we lift with our hips and not with our back. So the lumbopelvic segment stays in neutral. So the pelvis is level, okay, which means we have a slight amount of lordosis. So in neutral, remember the lumbar spine has a little bit of extension in a neutral position. It's a little bit extended anyway. That's normal. We just don't want excessive extension. So pelvis in neutral, a little bit of lumbar lordosis, and then we're focusing on using our glutes to rotate the hip joint as the pelvis is fixed in a neutral position. So this is where we're braced across the abdominal wall. So everything is locked in place, and then the action takes place about the hips. So if you've ever watched a young child, like a toddler, and they're toddling along and they find something on the ground that they like and they want to pick up, what do? Do they do this to pick it up? What do? They do this, right? Okay, did anyone teach them to do that? No. So what is the problem then with middle-aged adults when they see something? How come they do it like that? It's called gluteal amnesia. Gluteal amnesia, it's a real condition where we forget how to use our glutes, primarily the gluteus maximus. So that's what we're doing, is we're retraining activation of the gluteus maximus because we want to reduce our risk of back injuries, or if back injuries already exist, we're re-educating the movement pattern. So we're getting people's muscles to remember how they used to be when they were kids. So we live in a culture where physical activity is basically engineered out. If you didn't want to be active at all, you probably wouldn't have to, right? So we have to think of ways, we have to put it in our schedule to include physical activity. But we have to include the right kind of physical activity that's for our body and for the limitations that we have to provide the most benefit. So for people like professors that sit a lot, students that sit a lot, there's certain areas that we want to stretch on a daily basis. So we stretch our hip flexors, single and multi-joint hip flexors, but what do we need to strengthen? Glutes. Okay, that's a target area that's very, very important. So gluteus medius, another of the glutes. This one is kind of like the brachioradialis. Remember what was so unique about the brachioradialis? Yeah, so it has two opposing functions. This is very, very similar in that the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius, they internally rotate and flex the hip, whereas the posterior fibers of the gluteus medius, they externally rotate and extend the hip. So that's kind of interesting, and it all has to do with the axis of the hip joint. So if the fibers are in front versus the fibers being behind the axis of the hip, that determines what the action is. So all the fibers working together, kind of like the deltoid, it's kind of like the deltoid of the hip joint. So we have the anterior, lateral, or sometimes called medial deltoid, and then the posterior deltoid. And all of those fibers working together do what at the shoulder? Yeah, they abduct. Okay, but isn't it true that the anterior fibers have actions that are kind of opposite of the posterior? So it's kind of the same with the gluteus medius. So all the fibers working together would do what at the hip? Yeah. So open chain hip abduction, but what if it's closed chain? So now the lumbopelvic segment is moving about the femoral head, which is fixed, so it's going to laterally tilt the pelvis. Laterally tilt the pelvis in the frontal plane. So we have open chain hip abduction, but we can also have closed chain hip abduction where the pelvis is rotating about those femoral heads. So really important. So this brings us to this condition right here, Trendelenburg gait. So you're working with a client in your practice and you're observing their gait. Okay. So this person is obviously over-exaggerating. I don't know, maybe you've seen people walk down the street like that, but once you've studied this for so many years, you start to notice things as you're walking around every day. You kind of look over there, oh, that person's got a little bit too much rotation here or there, you know. You can't help it, you just start to see things. But I want you to notice the hip on the left has a shift, a lateral shift, every time the right foot comes up. So every time the left foot is in a weight-bearing stance and the right foot comes through, the pelvis does what? It shifts this way, okay? So what's going on there is you have a weakness in the contralateral gluteus medius. So the job of the gluteus medius on this side is to keep the pelvis level. So that can be challenging if the foot is coming through. Okay, the gluteus medius on this side has to contract this direction to keep the pelvis nice and level. Otherwise, if it's not keeping the pelvis level, I'm losing my balance, it's gonna kick the hip out like this. It's gonna drop to the side of the raised leg. So that's evident with this example right here. So the pelvis is going to drop towards the side of the raised leg. Now, something else I want you to notice, we have a weakness all the way up here in the hips, but notice what that can actually do at joints that are more distal to that. So the imbalance is here, but because of that imbalance, what do we got going on here? What is that when we have this inward movement of the knee joint? So that's valgus, okay, which can also cause overpronation of the foot. So what does overpronation of the foot mean? I mean, you're kind of bearing the weight on your arch as you come through. So on the medial side of the foot is where most of the pressure is. So can you see how everything is connected? Hip, the knee, the ankle. So if we have a weakness in one area, it can affect areas that are more distal to that. So we correct things that are going on up here, and guess what? We have better alignment all the way down. So that's just one muscle though. So here's an article. You'll be reading this article next week while I'm gone. It's called Gluteus Medius, Applied Anatomy, Dysfunction, Assessment, and Progressive Strengthening. So it's more of a rehab type article, but it's got a lot of relevant applications. So here's an example of someone in a static stance showing the Trendelenburg sign. So can you see the blue line would be level pelvis. So the red line means that the pelvis is dropping to the side of the unloaded side, the side that's raised. This would be great because the pelvis is not dropping to the side of the raised leg. The pelvis is still nice and level, which means the gluteus medius on this side is doing its job, right? It's holding the pelvis down, it's providing that force vector on the side of the pelvis to keep it nice and level. So just a simple test. It's static, so it's not the be-all end-all because people move, and it's not, but it's a start. So it's a baseline assessment. And then maybe you can do a little bit of video analysis to go from a static to more of a dynamic type of assessment. So this is a little bit more detailed picture about what's going on. So the side of the raised leg, the pelvis would be tipped towards that side. So we'd want to strengthen the gluteus medius on both sides, but in this case, with this leg raised, the gluteus medius on this side is weak. Okay, so here's what we would hope for. Okay, so we're doing analysis on our clients, and so we have a client before an intervention. Okay, so the hip has dropped 16 degrees and then the knee collapses into 26 degrees of valgus. Okay, so we take a similar picture after a period of training and look at the difference. You have everything nice and aligned. Hip, knee, and ankle. Pelvis is nice and neutral. Okay. So a couple of options. A different class would go into therapeutic modalities for all of this, but just a brief explanation here. This is a really good exercise. You're incorporating the muscles of the abdominal wall, so you're doing a bracing type action combined with a clam exercise. So how many of you have done similar type things? Okay, so very, very good. This is one, resistance bands are great. You can do a lot of things with those. So you have the resistance band tied here to the outside leg, and then you're stepping back into a reverse lunge. So if the gluteus medius is not doing its job, what's going to happen to this outside knee? It's going to move in towards the band. So this provides kind of a proprioceptive cue to keep your knee pushed out. So even with kids, you can do different things. So youth athletes still growing, Muscles are still making connections, bones are still fusing, they're still getting their full stature, but you have these nice bands that provide tools. So what this person is doing is cueing this person to brace, right? Abdominal bracing, and then providing a little bit of resistance. And what's she gonna do with that knee? She's gonna keep it turned out, right? So she's not gonna let it go into that valgus type collapse. So just simple things. Gluteus minimus, kind of like gluteus medius, just a little bit smaller and deeper. Okay, so it doesn't have quite the impact on the pelvis just because the mass is not as great, but just underneath, so you can't palpate it from the surface, but it has its insertion there on the greater trochanter as well. Okay, so tensor fascia lata. Okay, so something that, what can we think of? For this muscle, it actually shares a connection with the gluteus maximus. So isn't that interesting? It's muscles not only attach to bones like origin and insertion, but they also connect with each other, kind of like a highway system in your body. So this muscle has a physical connection with the gluteus maximus. So a few fibers of the gluteus maximus actually attach on the IT band, up high on the IT band here. So there's a connection between those two. So if you're doing hip thrust exercise where the cue is to generally push your knees out as you're extending the hip, you're definitely going to get some activation of the TFL here. Okay, now something else very important is this part down here can oftentimes be a problem, especially if you're a runner or you're running a lot of uneven surfaces or banked surfaces. This muscle can get really, really tight. So this huge tendon called the IT band comes down and inserts here at the Gerdy's tubercle. Okay, so we have rollers and all kinds of massage tools that are used to kind of just get that muscle, and it can hurt. Get those fibers, that collagen to realign. So collagen alignment and breaking up that scar tissue, it can be painful, but it can take a lot of the uneven stress off the knee joint. So a lot of times what can happen is if we get a really active or overactive TFL and a vastus lateralis, which is kind of in this same area and also attaches to the IT band, it can pull the patella in a lateral direction. So as the knee is flexing and extending, the cartilage on the undersurface of the patella is getting worn down on the lateral side. So we call that patellofemoral pain syndrome. So this uneven wear of cartilage due to this muscle imbalance where we have overactive vastus lateralis and then a very tight IT band. So one of the ways that we correct that, in addition to the massage, soft tissue work, is we try to improve activation of the vastus medialis. So it makes sense. If the vastus lateralis and the TFL are overactive and pulling the patella this direction, we've got to figure out a way to increase activity of the vastus medialis to pull the pelvis, or to pull the patella back where, it should be. Okay, so the exercise that we did this morning in lab, didn't we observe some pretty high vastus medialis type values with a dumbbell goblet squat? Yeah, especially Corey was just, boom, the whole screen was lighting up. So that's a great exercise. So dumbbell goblet squat, great exercise to get that improved activity of the vastus medialis. So how many of you have ever considered that during a squat, based on our overall state of muscle balance, that different parts of the quadriceps can contribute more or less to a movement? And not everybody's the same. So if you're a therapist and you've got all this nice equipment, you put it to good use and you look at how people activate their quadriceps during a squat. And so a a lot of you did really well at turning that dumbbell squat into a pretty good emphasis on that vastus medialis. So that'd be a great way to make sure that patella has balanced force. Okay, so hip flexors, lots of them. So I'd like you to do as much work as you can to get all of these committed to memory. 2 joint, single joint. So you've got the tensor fascia lata. What's this one right here? Yeah, sartorius. Right here. Pectineus. Rectus femoris, okay. Your iliopsoas, which includes how many muscles? 3, right? Okay, so your hip extensors. Which one am I not including on there? Adductor magnus, so stay away from the inner thigh machines at the gym. Just do your regular squats and lunges and all that good stuff. Okay, so the 4 that you already know about, listed them about a dozen times now. Okay, hip abductors. So gluteus medius. What's this one? And the minimus, maximus. Okay, which is just it's mostly an extensor, but it does abduct a little bit, and then the TFL right there. Okay, internal rotators. So these are muscles that have their insertion on the front rather than the back. So if it's the back, it's external rotator. So gluteus minimus, medius, it depends. Which fibers? Anterior fibers of the gluteus medius would kind of like the anterior fibers of the deltoids. So think of the gluteus medius as the deltoids of your hips. And then tensor fascia lata. External rotators. Okay, so we got the gluteus maximus and all 6 of those. So which one is the reason to do the external rotator stretch? With the bench and you have your leg up and yeah, piriformis, because it goes through this greater sciatic notch, which is where that sciatic nerve is at. So that's another one of those. So you've got your couch stretch, your external rotator stretch. That's your stretching. Okay, and then the other common one that we need to do, we need to get some work for the glutes every day. Okay, all right, so any questions? All right, happy Halloween. Let's stop right there.